Planning a Milky Way shoot is a fairly simple process. I only use two pieces of software for this. The first one is Google Earth, and the second is an app called Photo Pills for my phone. I use Google Earth to get a rough idea of the Milky Way location and what time. And then I use Photo Pills because it has an augmented reality app where you can actually see where the Milky Way is going to be relative to your subject on your phone in real time at any given time. So it's a really useful app which I'll show you more later on. Now I'm going in the assumption that you already have a location in mind and you know that it's possible to shoot the Milky Way there. I say that because there are few dark skies in the world today. It's much harder to shoot the Milky Way than it was previously. Even if a city is 30 miles away, that's still going to create enough light pollution to make it almost impossible to shoot a clear Milky Way. So make sure you've done your research to see if you can actually capture the Milky Way from that location. The second thing to remember is that we would ideally shoot any astrophotography or the Milky Way during a new moon. That's when the moon isn't visible in the sky anymore. However, we can shoot 4 or 5 days before and after that. So we have potentially 10 days where we can capture a nice clear Milky Way. The closer to the new moon we are, however, the clearer the Milky Way will be. Now, in terms of planning, firstly, if you don't have Google Earth, please go to your internet browser and download Google Earth and actually download the software to your desktop. If you use the app, which works inside of Google Chrome, we don't get the same number of options as we do compared to the software that we download on our desktop. So go to the actual Google Earth download page, and then you can download the software regardless of whether you're using Windows or Mac. When you've done that, open up Google Earth and you can follow along with me here. Now I'm going to choose the location I've already shot before and captured a very nice Milky Way, and that's Nugget Point in New Zealand. And you can see it's the top one here. Now I'm going to press search. And now when we've arrived at the location, we want to go down to more or less street view. So I'm going to choose somewhere along this path, roughly about here. And so we're right on the ground. I'm going to use these arrows to the right just to orientate ourselves. So I'm just spinning around and I want to be kind of on the path. So I'm just going to go back a little bit. In fact, I'm going to go forward a tiny bit so we can actually see the lighthouse, so you have a little bit of perspective. It doesn't look much like a lighthouse on here, but you can use your imagination. Now if we just look down, there's the lighthouse there, so I'm going to move forward a little bit more. And that's a little bit better. So now we're looking straight at the lighthouse right in front of us, and we can also see the horizon. If you want to look up a bit more, we can do that to look up, or we can look down a bit more. Now, no matter what we do, what changes we make, we're always going to have this position. So when it goes to nightfall, which you'll see soon, you won't be able to see the foreground, but it's still the same position that we're on. Now, to visualize the Milky Way, we can press this sun button up here. And because it's nighttime in New Zealand now, obviously it's nighttime on the map. So if we press this arrow to the right, you can see the Milky Way changes position. So if we go to 10 or 9:48, we can see the Milky Way going across to the right here, or some part of the galactic center going across to the right here. Now we can go all the way along left and we can see daytime and sunrise and the sunset. But this here is the actual galactic center that we want to try and capture. It's the bulk of the stars which makes up that really striking Milky Way shot that we often see. But obviously that's only visible at 7:48 a.m. So that's no good to us because it's the middle of the day. But if I choose this little icon here, I can set a different date. And I was there when I shot the location roughly in April. So I'm going to change the month to April and I'm going to leave it to the 9th and just press OK. Now, when I scroll all the way along and we get later, we can see some of the Milky Way here, but it's at a poor angle. It's also at 6:12 p.m, so it's too bright. But we're going to get the galactic core very soon. And if we keep moving along, so roughly at 3 a.m, a little bit further along, 3:24, this is the lighthouse down the bottom. We're going to get the Milky Way shooting right out the top of the lighthouse. Now, of course, we have to combine this with a new moon, so we might have to choose a different date, but you can see how useful this could be for planning a trip. Not only do we get to see our location before we go there by visiting it on Google Earth, we can also pre-visualize where the Milky Way is going to be at any given time. And through planning like this and using the Photo Pills app when I get to the location, this is the image I came out with for Nugget Point. Now, there is another piece of software you can use called Stellarium to plan your astrophotography. It's a bit more advanced. It gives you a lot more details, but I don't use it, so I'm not going to teach it here. But if you're curious, if you Google Dave Morrow's Stellarium tutorial, you'll come out with my friend Dave's tutorial, and he shows you how to use the software very effectively. So for me, that really is all there is to it when it comes to planning the Milky Way before we're on location. I mean, I just want a rough idea of where the Milky Way is going to be at what time. And with the Nugget Point example, I needed it to be over the lighthouse at a particular time on a particular date. Whereas when we're shooting other locations, we don't always need the Milky Way to be so precise. Sometimes we can change directions or change composition. We just need to know roughly where it's going to be at what time, but it doesn't have to be too precise. But when we get out in the field, I'm going to show you how I use the Photo Pills app to be much more exact. And the location I'm going to be shooting the Milky Way for this course is the lavender fields in France. And again, you can shoot that in all sorts of different directions. It doesn't matter too much. But when we get out into the field, I'm going to show you how we can use Photo Pills' augmented reality to plan everything out and to know almost minute by minute where the Milky Way is going to be. Now we know how to pre-plan an astrophotography trip in the office before you get to your location. What do you do when we finally get to the location? How do we compose? How do we know where the Milky Way is going to be relative to the subject that we're shooting? Well, we're going to look at that in this particular video. And now to start off with, we're in the lavender fields in France, in Valençon. And usually in these situations, you have to work with the leading lines that you're given. And you can choose to shoot straight on to complement those leading lines, or you can shoot diagonally. But essentially, we want most of the things to either point to the subject in the background or the Milky Way itself. Now, with this scene, we have to be a little bit careful because even though we have these gorgeous lavender fields and we can use them as leading lines, we also have these kind of yellow things here, these wheat, which isn't doing us any favors. It doesn't look very attractive in the image, as you can see in the image in front of you. So when it comes to actually shooting, even if we capture a beautiful Milky Way and all of the post-processing is great, we'll still have these yellow things sticking out of our lavender fields, and it will ruin the image and it will make the image less attractive. But before we talk about a different composition, I want to show you how I plan where the Milky Way is going to be relative to subjects that we shoot. And I do that with my Photo Pills app. So I open up Photo Pills and there's an option on the first screen called Night AR. And this lets me just point my camera at the subject and I can move by touching the screen the image around, and we can see the position of the Milky Way at any time during the day, or the galactic center, because that's what we really want to shoot. So in this scene, it says at around 3:10, we're going to get a fantastic Milky Way shot, as you can see in the image on your screen. Now, the reason why I say it's fantastic is because we can get the Milky Way coming up out over that building, and we have these lines pointing towards the building, so there's continuity, which is what I talked about a lot in the compositional video. Now, it also is very similar in terms of composition to the Milky Way lighthouse one I shot at Nugget Point. So I'm using the same principles here. But as I said before, I don't think this composition is going to work particularly well because we have too many of these yellow things kind of ruining the scene. So I'm going to change my location just a little bit and go for a more off-center approach where the lines are diagonally pointing towards this building and again to the Milky Way. And hopefully we can find a nice row of lavender without these yellow things in it. Since that composition didn't really work out, I've changed now. So we're still using the house as a main subject. We've still got these converging lines, but we're off center. So we're using diagonal lines that point us again to that building. Now, I know I said in the compositional video that we should try to look for continuity in our photo. So in this example, we would obviously use the converging lines, then the building, and then the Milky Way at the top. And that creates a sense of completion when the viewer looks at the image. But our Photo Pills app tells us that the Milky Way is going to be over the building in around 2:40. The problem is, because I'm shooting landscape, much of the image to the left in the sky is going to be empty. It's going to be dead space because the Milky Way is going to be going more or less straight up, with slightly slanting to the left. To try and curb that, we can always go for the Milky Way slightly to the left of the building. And that way it might complement the shape of these lines, the direction of the lines in the foreground, but it might also be pointing towards that building as well to some degree. So it would still have a small sense of continuity. So I think this composition works a little bit better. Now I'd like to talk a bit about composition with Milky Way shots. A lot of people tend to think of the Milky Way as being the main subject in our photo, but actually that isn't the case most of the time. The Milky Way is no different to a sunset or sunrise. It's a mood enhancer. So sometimes when I see images online from photographers, the main subject, the Milky Way, to them is massively huge in the sky, but the foreground subjects are almost non-existent. But I'm going to say that the foreground is even more important than the Milky Way itself. If you get a good foreground and some nice Milky Way stars, you're going to have a great image. So one of the things I routinely do is a vertical panorama for Milky Ways. You see, if I'm shooting really wide and I pan up slightly, it squashes the foreground and minimizes it. As you can see in this image here from a different location, the foreground's flat, it doesn't look very impactful, even though the Milky Way looks pretty good. Now, in this scene, that means I'm going to point the camera down so that I bring out some of that gorgeous lavender field details and lines. Then, when I finish shooting the foreground, I'll pan up and shoot the sky. Now, when it comes to shooting, that's a different kettle of fish entirely. Lens-wise, we need something that's going to be shooting in around f2.8 or smaller f-stop, so 1.8, 2, 2.8, 2.4, anything like that allows a lot more light to get in. If we're shooting with something like f4, we're just not going to get enough light in. It's just going to cause too much noise to try and drag as many details as you can out of those raw files. So 2.8 and lower is better. Wide angle is essential as well because the Milky Way is so large, and often the scene that we're shooting is so large that we need to go wide. If we're shooting at 50 millimeters, for example, or 70 millimeters, we're going to have to do a lot of panoramic shots just to get the Milky Way. And at that point, the Milky Way will be in a different position after you've shot maybe the third or fourth image. So we really need to be looking in a wide angle with an aperture of at least 2.8 as its smallest aperture. ISO, that's got to go to the maximum ISO in your camera. And now when I shoot, I always shoot the foreground first because that's not moving. We can have a lot of time to prepare that. It doesn't really make a difference if we spend 20 minutes shooting it or 10 minutes or 5 minutes. We've got to get that right. So here I would shoot with an ISO of a lot lower, so I think it goes up to 6,400 on this camera, which is what I'll be using when I shoot the Milky Way. But when I shoot the foreground, I'll be more at about 2,500 ISO. Now for shutter speed for the foreground, I'll bring it up to about 4 minutes, and that'll give us a nice bright foreground. So when I've done that and I have a good foreground that I'm happy with, I can shoot the Milky Way, but I won't move my camera because I know we have to pan up, but first we have to shoot the Milky Way from this angle as well. So my settings will be f2.8, an ISO of 6,400 on this particular camera, and I'm in manual mode, so I go to between 20 and 30 seconds. So your shutter speed will depend on the location that you're shooting. Sometimes when you shoot 30 seconds, you'll see the stars have a little bit of movement, but in other locations, they'll be nice and sharp at 30 seconds. So that's why we arrive nice and early to shoot the Milky Way, so we can do some test shots to work out whether or not we need to shoot at 20, 25 or 30 seconds. So I'm going to work that out tonight as I'm shooting. But I'll probably be shooting at about 25, 30 seconds, I imagine. So once we finish shooting the Milky Way from the foreground position, we need to immediately pan up quickly, keep the settings exactly the same, make sure your virtual horizon, if you have one, is on the live view, so you have a straight horizon, and then just take your shot very quickly. And we have to do that quickly because the stars are moving in relation to the Earth. So the longer we leave it, the more out of sync the two tiles that we'll be shooting will be. So that's how I'd shoot the Milky Way, a vertical panorama. But I'm going to try a different composition here just to make sure that we get a good shot. Because while I think this is okay, and I do like the diagonal lines, I think the building being just a little bit off center isn't working as well as I'd like it to be. So this might be an okay shot, but I'm going to try one from the other side. this is our final composition for the Milky Way in this location, and I like it for different reasons. Firstly, the lavender fields along here are all beautifully purple. We don't have the yellow weeds that we see sticking out in different places. So we've got these lovely textures, colours that aren't broken up. We have these great lines that point right to this corner bit in the building, so it's almost lined up ideally for us. And we have the tree at the back sticking out rather than at the front like we had in the other composition. So I think that looks a little bit better. Sadly, if we're shooting in this direction, we're going to be getting the tail end of the Milky Way. And PhotoPills shows us that around 2 o'clock, we're going to have the Milky Way above this house. So I'm going to try this. I'm going to go for a portrait shoot. So I'm going to go long ways. I'm going to try and get as much of the foreground as I can. And then I'm going to pan up, just as I said before, and I'm going to try and capture the tail end of the Milky Way. The stars aren't going to be as dramatic shooting in this direction, but we still might be able to get something. And like I said before, the Milky Way is just a mood enhancer. It's not the subject. So if I can capture a good foreground with these lavender fields and this hut, enough of the tail of the Milky Way, then I think that'll be a pretty good composition. So we'll have a look tonight and we'll see how the conditions pan out, but I think we might be in with a pretty good image here.